welcome Reverend Miriam Rosenberg. It's a vote for us that you are with us. To welcome the rabbis who are speaking and the rabbis who are speaking. And Rabbi Zach's family is here, so his family of origin as well. So I want to welcome his parents and sister. It's an evening to celebrate the author and to celebrate Jen, who took you through all this, and to engage in the two outstanding thinkers of contemporary or modern Judaism. I'm asked because Zach was an early student, was a student of mine, and at the very beginning I saw that he had the mind of a trained engineer, and he is, and very well understood in learning the notion of creating systems and difficulties in systems and how you work with systems. Later on, I saw, to my surprise, that he also had, besides a brain, a terrific heart, a heart of a poet. See the nuances, who would soar and come down from the soaring when need be. He became a learned rabbi and a learning rabbi and a teaching rabbi, and he became a leader in this community, which is evident in Cleveland, and now has a very important role in the International Basin. And that's important in terms of the theology, because he understands where these things go to. Where, you make a theological, make a psak, I'm sure you know where it goes to. But you make a theology, what type of people? What type of people, what type of things will be created? From Zion, short term for this book, is a beautiful work. He clearly and articulately describes the arcs of both great thinkers, and he understands where they're going. He alerts us to the nuances of their arguments, and he supplies those things that seem to be missing that we need to know. I have to say, bravo, this is just a wonderful thing. We look forward to the other works and the other celebrations. And the next work, there'll be a very good and clear index, and the next celebration, there'll be women on the panel. Into all this. I want to engage for a moment just as an introduction to the work. I stand here with you. I might be alone in this, but I stand here with you as a recovering religious scientist. I don't know what to do. People don't even know where to, people before, when we talk to politics, they don't even know where to put their votes. And I have two questions that come with it. I won't read from my notes, but I want to go quicker. My first question, which is a big question for me, is are they right? It's a new government, right? The ones who made me into a recovering Zionist. Are they right that they're the true Talmidim of Rav Kook? Is the combination of Rav Kook's incredible messianism, which also leads to messianic disappointment and anger, and then all sorts of other mischievous devices. Is Rav Kook's unlocking of great passions? Is Rav Kook's maintaining that we will achieve a perfected society, and perfection is very close to totalitarianism? Is the emphasis on intuitive thinking above even Readers halacha? He's a clear thinker, Rav Kook. He's a big gaon. But this emphasis on intuitive thinking and theology, is this like a big mistake? And is the connection of our land, our holy land, into holiness itself, close to the Godhood, and allowing the land to be a reflection of a Kodesh Baruch Hu, actually a heresy that has produced the problem that we're in with right now? With regard to, never thought I'd say it like that. Regarding Rav Shagar, who I come to through Zach, he has a very nuanced, sophisticated way of understanding postmodernism, and the ups and downs and the shades of understanding and the different types of belief that comes in a postmodern orientation, which is a description, I think, of a prescription. But, thank you, I got that. But with that, we're not dealing today with anybody who's a postmodern there. They're happy. They're grinning. They don't have any hesitation in terms of what they believe. The only thing for them is disbelief is what they ascribe to you. They think you're not the believer. You think that you hesitate too much, and I'm pointing to you because I mean you as the writer. And what the hell we do with that? And I'm looking to see whether or not his thought, which is brilliant and beautiful, whether or not it is workable. So those are two things I'm trying to understand. I'm trying to understand Rav Kook a little bit better. Is he the source? And is he also part of the cure? And is Rav Shagar himself part of the remedy? And we continue to solve it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Landes. Okay, so the next part of the program, we're going to interview Rabbi Dr. and go a little bit deeper into the book. Before we go into the book, I wanted to talk a little bit about how I met Rabbi Dr. For years I've been reading the articles, and you really wrote some amazing articles on the internet. You can just find them in many places. And,
Can you speak up a little louder, please?
Yeah. So for many years I was reading Rabbi Truba's articles online, and I kept on thinking to myself, am I ever going to meet him and talk to him? And then one day I came across a Facebook page where he said he just made Aliyah to Israel. And I said to myself, I'm just going to contact him and we'll see if he wants to meet me. And just like that, we started communicating and talking. And we started talking about Rav Kook and Rav Shagar together. And for years I've been teaching Rav Kook's writings and Rav Shagar. So I found in Rabbi Truba a real, not just a friend, but a chavruta. And I would add Rabbi Levi Moro to that trio. I don't know where he's sitting. So us three are always communicating, talking about Rav Kook and Rav Shagar. And it really is, I feel like this book is not just your book. I feel like really overjoyed that these ideas that we've been talking about, speaking about for years together, really are just written so beautifully and articulate. As I said in my introduction, the book isn't just ideas. Rabbi Truba really writes, like Rabbi Daniel said, in this poetic way, and you can really feel this energy inside of the book. If you give the book a chance and you really sit with it and read it, you will feel more than just getting ideas. There's a true feeling of, I don't want to over-exaggerate, but there's a feeling like you're really grappling with truth when you're reading this book, and the words that you wrote are very inspiring for me as a teacher of Rav Kook and Rav Shagar's writings. It makes me believe what I'm teaching is actually not just something I love, but truth. So thank you very much for writing the book. I want to invite you out and ask you some questions. Yeah. Can everybody hear me? Okay, so the first question I want to ask you is about the book itself. To write a book is not just to write about ideas. The author usually goes through a very personal journey. And I want to ask you about the journey. How did you come across Kook and Rav Shagar? Maybe separately, you could talk about one and then the other. And what was it about that initial meeting of them that drew you to them?
Thank you. So my encounter with Rav Kook and ultimately with Rav Shagar as well began 2 weeks after my wife and I got married. We came to Israel with the intention of being here for the year, at least the year, to study Torah, at that time at Machon Brandeis, with the hope that it would become something longer. We both had dreams of making Aliyah. We weren't sure at the time whether it was something we could do, but we knew that we wanted to be here, and we wanted to be here for as long as we could. And it was coming here, again, 2 weeks after our wedding, that was my first real encounter with Torah Eretz Yisrael. Being here, being in these neighborhoods, we used to live in Katamon, this is almost 20 years ago now, and encountering just anybody and anyone who had what to contribute to this idea of the rebirth, the renewal of Torah here in the land of Israel. My encounter with Rav Kook was initially through Rav Landes. Maybe one of the most impactful shiurim I've ever heard in my life was a shiur Rav Landes gave on Rav Kook's Shir Merubeh, the fourfold song, which Rav Landes was able to teach in such a way that really feels as if you are progressing higher and higher through the different levels of the song.
I've improved it.
You've improved it. To actually maybe get a glimpse of the harmony that Rav Kook is aspiring to and dreaming for. Again, for me, Rav Kook, there were two dimensions of his thought that I found compelling and still very much find compelling. It's his desire to bridge what appears to be unbridgeable, right? His commitment to the belief that the religious world and the secular world can live together, that they really, really can live together because they must. And to see somebody whose commitment to that enables him to see things that nobody else can see is just profoundly inspiring and thought-provoking. Because again, if you grow up in religious Zionism, if you grow up in modern Orthodoxy, there's a lot of lip service paid to the idea that we are supposed to bridge the religious and the secular. We talk about it all the time. We talk about it so much that it doesn't really seem to mean anything. And then you open up Rav Kook, and you see somebody who is literally, with every word on the page, trying to weave those things together. That was the first piece for me with Rav Kook. And the second piece is Rav Kook's, as it was said, his poetic soul, right? Poets see things other people don't see. And they are able to weave words together in such a way as to enable others to see what they didn't see before. And that is also infused in every page of Rav Kook, every word of Rav Kook. I've come to really appreciate poets and people who can see, like I said, what others can't see, to weave words together in a way that people haven't ever spoken them or written them before. For me, in many ways, Rav Shagar, though he is in some ways a very different thinker, was a continuation of that journey for me with Rav Kook. I picked up Rav Shagar's, it wasn't his first published book, but Kelim Shvurim, which was a work published right before he passed away. I picked it up before we returned back to America because I sensed something in it that reminded me of Rav Kook, even though I couldn't exactly put my finger on what it was. I knew he was doing something similar, this desire to bridge between Kodesh and Chol, and I knew he was doing it with a sense of fierce commitment that, as you said before, I try on some level to live up with the book, which is this pursuit of emet, right? That if there's one thing Rav Kook and Rav Shagar are driven towards, it is emes, and the belief that it's there, even if we can't always see it. And over time, I would find myself keep going back to Rav Shagar's writings, even though I did not fully understand them at first. I'm not sure anybody does. I mean, one of the wonderful things about getting to know Rav Shagar's students is that they will all tell you that the first time they heard Rav Shagar, that they didn't really understand exactly what was going on. Not always because it was so deep, or he cited sources I think he's never heard before that was certainly true, but because he was operating on a different wavelength, in a way that sort of cut under and cut against the way we often experience Torah study, but ultimately in the best possible fashion. As I kept returning to Rav Shagar and seeing his commitment to, again, bridging the unbridgeable, to scouring the works of secular philosophy and what's referred to as postmodern thought, again, that search for emes, and to recognize that Torah can only be found there, and that even if it seems impossible, maybe the impossible can be possible, or maybe just living with the impossible is what it means to be human. And for me, Rav Kook and Rav Shagar represent all of that, and to bring them together was to me so natural, not maybe always to anybody else who is a specialist of Rav Kook or a specialist of Rav Shagar, but as Rav Shagar describes himself, he calls himself in some of his writings if Rav Kook is the father of religious Zionism, Rav Shagar goes out of his way to say, then I have to be a son, right? Because the only way you can be a son is if you are a part of a tradition, right? To be a son, you have to be a father. And you get your identity from those who come before you, those you have an intimate relationship with. And Rav Shagar has his issues with Rav Kook, many of which were laid out beautifully by Rav Landes. Like almost everything Rav Landes said of critiquing Rav Kook, we can find in Rav Shagar's writings. But at the same time, when children look at their parents and see their faults, that's maybe when real love can finally begin. And I see that very, very much with Rav Shagar. And to bring the two of them together, to me, feels very natural. And I hope as people read the book, they'll see how the two live together. I think not just for me, but can for a lot of us as well.
Beautiful. There's a story that a student of Rav Shagar told me that they used to learn in Siach, in one of Rav Shagar's yeshivot that still exists today, and they would learn before Shacharit Rav Kook's writings. Rav Shagar would teach Rav Kook's writings, the Shmona Kavatzim, which are the 8 spiritual journals of Rav Kook, and they would sit and have coffee while he would read a piece, and then he would explain it. And maybe 1 or 2 students would come. There wouldn't be many students who would come early in the morning. So this one student told me, one time he came to this early morning Rav Kook shiur, and Rav Shagar was reading Rav Kook's writings and explaining it, and the student said, I don't believe in that. That doesn't make any sense. I don't agree with that idea of Rav Kook at all. And Rav Shagar looked at him and said, yeah, I don't agree with it either, but the next piece I do. And the student told me that he felt shocked that why are you teaching Rav Kook if you don't agree with everything? On the other hand, he was very inspired. He's teaching him, and he didn't just teach Rav Kook. And I heard this from many students. He taught every single piece of the Shmona Kavatzim. We're talking about thousands of pieces, from cover to cover. So he was dedicated to teaching Rav Kook. That's not a thing most rabbis or any rabbis would do. So this is a rabbi who really was on the one hand critical and able to ask questions about Rav Kook, but on the other hand, like you said, Rabbi, that he was had this love towards Rav Kook. So I want to ask you, with this book, it kind of feels a little bit like you are that experience in that shiur in Rav Shagar, where you'll disagree with Rav Kook sometimes in the middle of the book, and then you'll say how much you agree with another idea of his. And with Rav Shagar as well, you have moments where you'll be praising his ideas, and then you'll have a little paragraph where you'll say, well, maybe it doesn't work exactly here. So I want to ask you a little bit about what makes this book different to other books written about Rav Kook and Rav Shagar, and how would you describe what is your contribution to writing about Rav Kook and Rav Shagar?
That's a good question. So one of the interesting things about thinkers, rabbis, like Rav Kook and Rav Shagar, is the interest in them in their writings from worlds outside of their world, right? So both Rav Kook and Rav Shagar in their lifetimes had relationships with people that we think of as academics, right? Very, very prominent, well-known academics. Rav Kook had relationships with everybody from Shal Lieberman to Gershom Shalom, and Rav Shagar had relationships with all sorts of people in academia and students who went into academia. But what's always so clear with Rav Kook and Rav Shagar, and they're both explicit about this in their writings, is as much as they love academia, or as much as they have an appreciation for the work of academia, they also see themselves as doing something different. They see themselves as doing Torah, as teaching Torah. And I think that distinction is very important for me personally. And again, I'm not trying to sort of critique academia. I mean, if you come to my apartment across the street, you'll see I got hundreds of academic works, and they do unbelievable things. But again, the work of academia is to understand texts in the context of which they were produced, to understand the influences that made them what they are. And that is extraordinarily important work, because you can't understand anything if you don't understand the context in which it was produced and what it was intended to say within that context. On the other hand, as we all know, Torah is striving to do something a little bit different, because Torah can never be rooted in a particular time or place in the past, right? Torah has to be in the here and now, right? To study Torah, to teach Torah, and again, Rav Kook and Rav Shagar are both very clear about this, means to hear God's voice, to even speak God's voice in the here and now. And so my book, in that sense, was really trying to do that with them and their Torah, in the sense of trying to grapple with what does it mean right here, right now. If we really try to live this, if we really try to experience this, not in an ideal world, not in an ivory tower, but in the real world, what does that look like? And again, with both Rav Kook and Rav Shagar, they are often grappling from very real and profound issues that is directly emerging from the world they're encountering and the people they are encountering. It's an interesting thing. Both of them have a great love for sort of theoretical Torah, esoteric Torah, but their best pieces, are the ones that emerge for Rav Kook from an experience that he had, like talking to somebody on the street of Yaffo, or emerge from Rav Shagar, like that conversation he had with a student outside of Shir, where that student is bringing that dilemma, that problem that there's no other rabbi in the world that he can speak to about it. And when you realize that their Torah emerges from there, it enables you to see the great power that exists within it. And so in the book, I really try to do that. I really try to let their Torah speak in the here and now, and often through my own experiences. One of the things I try to do in some of the chapters is try to show, like, these are ideas, these are texts that I am trying to live, and not just trying to analyze and teach. And for me, that is what Torah is at its essence. And I think Rav Kook and Rav Shagar would certainly would expound upon that too.
I just want to add to what Rabbi Truev said about the personal part of this book. If you read this book, you'll find really it's like different genres inside the book. Sometimes there's this historical part of your writing coming out, where you'll describe what was happening to Rav Kook in his time period, what was happening to Rav Shagar in his life. He had this experience in this war. And then you'll start explaining the spiritual concepts, and it'll turn into a completely different book. And then you'll start talking about your own life experiences and certain painful moments you've gone through in your life, and how Rav Shagar or Rav Kook came to you, so to speak. Their ideas came and really helped you. So it really is amazing when you're reading this book. You get this feeling like it isn't just one dimension. There's a lot of things going on in the book, and that's why I said you really have to just sit and read it slowly. And I think that's a very exciting thing for a book to do. Often they say in Hebrew books, like, every word is meaningful and you have to read the sentence again and again. And sometimes we feel like English books about Judaism, they're not so profound. They're just like a translation of a deep idea in Hebrew. But it really doesn't feel like that when you're reading this book. And you really have succeeded in making the sentences dense. They're intense. And we've talked about this a lot, how when you write, I'm talking about the way you write, it really causes me to have to read it over and over again. And that's not because I didn't understand it. There's just so much in every sentence. And that's a huge accomplishment. And it's actually just very exciting to read. Okay, I want to ask you another question. So the way the book is split up is Rabbi Truev split it up. The first half is about Rav Kook and all these different topics that Rav Kook wrote about. And the second half is about Rav Shagar. So it's like you're on a journey when you're reading the book. And so I want to ask you, let's start with Rav Kook, and then we'll go to Rav Shagar, and then we'll go back and forth a little. Okay, so one of the chapters in the book about Rav Kook is called Zionism, Good for the Jews or Good for All. And in this chapter, Rabbi Truev talks about how Rav Kook loves the Jewish people. He has this deep, deep love of Am Yisrael. It's not a secret that Rav Kook was obsessed with Am Yisrael. He has all these amazing statements about every Jew is holy. It doesn't matter if they're a secular Jew, if they're an atheist. There's this incredible love of all of Am Yisrael. On the other hand, Rabbi Truev brings up in this essay, Rav Kook says you can't be blind and just say every single thing a Jew says and everything Am Yisrael does is good. You have to be able to be critical even of those things you love the most. So I want to ask you, can you talk a little bit about that tension in Rav Kook's writings about, on the one hand, loving Am Yisrael, and then on the other hand, being critical when you need to be?
Yeah. So, again, everybody knows Rav Kook is the father of religious Zionism. Rav Kook is the one, he's not the only one, but he is the driving force of turning orthodoxy towards embracing what the Zionist project is about through the sheer force of his will and charisma and his Torah, and then the impact of his students, and even further. And so everybody knows him as this great religious Zionist, great lover of Israel, great lover of the land. For me, the profound revelation occurred when I read Professor Yehudah Mirsky's dissertation a number of years ago, where Yehudah analyzes Rav Kook's writing about Zionism before Rav Kook comes to the land of Israel, so before 1904. Now, these articles that he writes in a series of journals are sometimes described as being really like critical of Zionism, or even almost like anti-Zionist, which is, if you actually read them, is very strange. They're not that at all. When you look at them closely, you see something truly fascinating going on. Because what Rav Kook is doing in these series of essays is he is seeing the good within Zionism, and he is also seeing the dangerous potential of Zionism. And he's able to hold both of those together at the same time. And to see him do that was just, like I said, a revelation for me, because nobody describes him that way, and very few religious Zionist thinkers ever really are holding those things in tension. So to see him do that just showed me that, like, we can do this. We can be Zionists, we can love Jews, but we don't have to be blind to the evils that Zionism can perpetuate, that Zionism may be internally inclined to perpetuate, as nationalism so often is. And so that, for me, I think is like the primary model of how I think about religious Zionism. And it's one that, unfortunately, again, without even going into all the messianic ramifications of Rav Kook's thought, even for people who consider themselves to be secular Zionists, it is profoundly difficult for them to hold those two things together. To love the Jewish people, to be a Zionist, and to realize that when you are a Zionist, you are playing with fire, and that means people can get burned, sometimes literally, unfortunately. And that's a model that I think we all have to hold on to. And again, I think it stems, as was mentioned, and it's a line that I say frequently, from Rav Kook's love, right? Love cannot mean blind acceptance. Love cannot mean we project a fantasy onto the beloved of what we want them to be, right? True love, and I think we all know this, if you're a parent or if you're a spouse, it means being able to see the other in their fullness. And that is hard, and that can be scary, but it is the only way to actually be in a face-to-face relationship with them. And again, there are times where Rav Kook gets a little bit overly enthusiastic about the Jewish people, but I always come back to those essays, and I realize that's the orientation. If you're going to call yourself a Zionist, you have to be able to do that. And you see that very much in Rav Shagar as well, right? Rav Shagar is deeply sensitive to the excesses of Zionism and religious Zionism. And again, the political world doesn't allow for anything beyond black and white, but if you're going to call yourself a Zionist or a religious Zionist, you have to be able to hold that orientation. It's one that's almost completely absent from any discussion of Rav Kook now. Like, I love bringing up all the Rav Kook criticisms of religious Zionism. Nobody ever sees them, right? Even though it's just like Pashut. Like, he's not saying anything, he's saying common sense, right? But people just can't even imagine such things exist. Rav Amiel says very similar things, right? Nationalism becomes collective egoism, right? Nationalism becomes about dominating the other, right? The other doesn't exist, right? It's just about projecting yourself as far as it ultimately can go. And even 100 years plus later, we still have so much to learn from Rav Kook, just how to be a Zionist on a very basic level.
Amazing. I could respond to that, but I want to get to the rest of the evening. Okay, so let's go to Rav Shagar. There are so many essays to pick from. Just to read the content, table content, it's really just so exciting. So I'm just going to pick chapter 9. So in chapter 9, it's called No Place Like Home, Jewish Identity in a Postmodern World. So Rabbi Trueff in this essay talks about how often modern Orthodox and religious Zionists, they feel very lost in their identities. They feel, Rav Shagar says, like they're citizens of multiple worlds. On the one hand, they feel obviously they're part of the Torah world, but on the other hand, they identify with a lot of secular values. On the one hand, they feel very Jewish. On the other hand, there's a lot of non-Jewish books of psychology and philosophy and even film that they see themselves inside of. So Rav Shagar says there's this dilemma and this almost crisis going on inside of us where I don't really know who I am. I feel lost. I don't feel like I have a home. So I want to ask you a little bit about Rav Shagar's solution. Rav Shagar has this word he coined, deitiyut, which is very hard to translate. And Rabbi Levi Moreau and Rabbi Dr. and I, we have spent hours trying to figure out how would you translate the word deitiyut. Does it mean at home, homeness? So I want to ask you a little bit about why Rav Shagar thinks Beitiyut, why that is a solution to this feeling of, I feel lost. I have so many identities, I don't know who I am.
So what's interesting is that for Rav Kook, I'll start with Rav Kook before I go to Rav Shagar, right? The religious Jew knows who they are, right? And the non-religious Jew also knows who they are, to a large extent, because in his time, both came from the same place, right? Secular Zionists, the Rav Kook encounters, are growing up in deeply religious families in the Pale of Settlement, and the religious Jews who come to Israel obviously grow up in deeply religious, deeply religious homes and live their lives that way. I'm not sure Rav Kook, or if he did, it was very little. Did he engage Jews who had been assimilated for generations, right? It wasn't a reality he really understood, and even to the extent he encountered it, he would just think they're one step away from returning, right? In the decades since Rav Kook, as we all know, right, Jewish identity has become infinitely more, it's complicated then, it's become infinitely more complicated now. And for Rav Shagar, part of what makes his thought so compelling to me is that he is willing to acknowledge the fact that religious Zionists and modern Orthodox Jews, in this wonderful dual identity that they aspire to create for themselves, often lose their sense of having a real Jewish identity. And they often feel alienated from Torah and from the Jewish tradition. Leads to assimilation. It leads to all sorts of challenges. And it's fascinating that Rav Shagar says this because it's a profound self-criticism. Right? The whole argument of religious Zionism and modern Orthodoxy to the Haredi world is to say what? Is to say we can be as firm as you. Right? We just also have college degrees. We just also make a real living, but we can be just as firm as you. And Rav Shagar is standing, in his writings, making very clear, he's saying, guys, it's a lot more complicated than that. What we're doing often comes with a cost that often makes us feel as if we don't really know, to the extent that we are authentically Jewish. And there's a profound jealousy that often pervades religious Zionism and Orthodoxy towards the Haredi world, even unconsciously, right? They're the real Jews. We're still sort of, play acting a bit. And much of Rav Shagar's thought is dedicated to this question. And I have to assume it emerges from his engagement with his students who don't quite feel at home in being a religious Jew, even though they grew up in religious homes. And his thought is grappling with this sense of how can we have an authentic relationship to Torah, right? How can we feel at home? And maybe the most significant idea the many ideas he develops to sort of pull this together, but for the primary one that at least I'll focus on right now is the idea of brit, is the idea of covenant. That which we have a covenantal relationship with means we have an intimate relationship with it. That when you are in a covenant with your spouse, with God, with your fellow Jews, right? The covenantal relationship is such that you don't know where you end and the other begins, right? That there is something natural and obvious about that dynamic. Doesn't always mean the dynamic is easy, but there is something about it that you can't escape, and therefore it feels natural, and it's just who you are. And what Rav Shagar demands or asks his students to aspire to is to make a brit with the Torah. It is to make a brit with God and with the Jewish people. To recognize that their commitment to these things, their connection to these things, can be real. And what's important for Rav Shagar is he recognizes that faith commitments, and again, whether we call it modern or postmodern, can't really ever be justified, right? There are no proofs for God that I or anybody in this room can pull out for you that are going to be deeply and profoundly convincing. There are no proofs for Torah Sinai that anybody in this crowd can pull out for you that are going to be terribly convincing. But I think as everybody in this room knows, whatever proofs or justifications or whatever rationalizations we can't ever come up with, right? These things are real for us in ways that words will never fully be able to capture. Right? For Rav Shagar to make a brit with the Torah, and it's an idea that animates my life. He says this, citing one of his teachers. It's to marry the Torah. It's an idea that's very prominent in Chazal. It's to study Torah so much that you can't live without it. Right? It's to love God so much you can't live without God. It's to love the Jewish people. It's to love the land of Israel. It's to be committed to these things in such a way that just exceeds our capacity, as I said, to rationalize or justify them. and to recognize that because of that, they're just an intrinsic part of our life, whether we like it or not. And that's what enables us to stop asking ourselves, like, should I do this? Should I not do this? What about this? What about that? Like, at the end of the day, like, you study Torah. At the end of the day, right, you daven, at the end of this, we'll daven mar, right? These are just things you do, right? We're not going to have good explanations for them, but they extend, like all covenantal commitments, from the deepest part of ourselves to the deepest part of ourselves that ultimately touch the other.
Yeah, it reminds me of a story a student of Rav Shagar told me that one time a student came to Rav Shagar and said, I'm finding it very hard to connect to Shabbat. And this was actually a Baal Tshuva student of Rav Shagar. Most of his students were born religious, but this one was a Baal Tshuva, and it was a woman actually, and she came to Rav Shagar and said, it's really not enjoyable to keep Shabbat. And my friends don't keep Shabbat, and all the houses I go to do Shabbat, I'm not really enjoying talking to those people. What do you think I should do, Rav Shagar? And he said, have you spoken to any other rabbis? And she said, yeah, I went to these rabbis, and they said, if you really, really love God, Shabbat will be amazing eventually, don't worry. And she said, well, it's just not like that. It doesn't feel like that. It doesn't feel amazing Shabbat all the time. Sometimes it does. So what do you recommend, Rav Shagar? And so Rav Shagar said, I'm going to summarize. I'm not going to say the exact thing he said, because it's very intense to say. I don't want to put it on TV, on YouTube. But it was harif, but I'll say it in a nicer way. He said, in the Torah it says a Jew keeps Shabbat, and it says in the Torah a goy doesn't keep Shabbat. So choose. Do you want to be a Jew or a goy? That's it. Wow. And choose. It's up to you. And the student told me that she felt like Rav Shagar was holding the mountain of Har Sinai on top and saying, you get to choose right now. And she chose the Torah, and she's still religious till this day, and Baruch Hashem, she's married. So that was like a Rav Shagar moment where it's saying, you get to, this is your bayit. I don't have to rationalize and justify why keep Shabbat, because it's going to inspire you every single second. If you're a Jew, that's enough of a reason to do Shabbat, and you'll figure out how to make it meaningful, and you can learn Torah and figure out how to do that, but you have to commit to it, to make that Brit, right, like you said.
Right. I'll just add one point. The other idea that Rav Shagar talks extensively about is this notion of Kabbalah Atzmit, accepting oneself. And I think it's hard to always understand what he means by that, but I think what he means is he's asking us to be sensitive to who we really are. And one of the hardest things in today's world is to understand what is truly non-negotiable for us, right? Because everything is for sale. There's always a million options. There's always pressure to change, to be different, to be better. And it's very, very easy to lose sight of the things that really are fundamental to who we are as human beings. And Rav Shagar is often asking us to do, and it's in many ways a lifelong process, is to understand it. It's not always about making the bread. It's not always about choose in this moment. A lot of times it's about look deep in yourself and find those things that you can't live without. And that requires a lot of effort. It requires being able to separate oneself from all the noise and the distractions. It also requires sometimes one to break away, like you said, to keep Shabbat or not. Am Yisrael did not really know whether or not the Torah could be something that could be theirs until God wasn't really around so much anymore, right? Sometimes it often means the absence of these things in our lives before we actually understand what they mean to us, that they are inextricable, they are non-negotiable. That's not something you're going to hear most rabbis tell you, that, maybe you should stop keeping Shabbat if you're going to actually find out what Shabbat means to you. But as we know, we don't often understand the meaning of things for us until they are no longer there. And I think Rav Shagar makes us very sensitive to that, and we have to be, if we're going to have any real understanding of what our commitments are, and what are the things that truly matter to us in life, right? The things that we love, right, are always going to exceed our capacity to rationally justify why we love them. And as is often the case, unfortunately, with the people that we love, we don't realize how much they are part of us and we are part of them until they are no longer here. And that is also true with God, Torah, and the Jewish people in our relationship to them. Maybe we'll do one more question.
Okay.
Then we'll go on.
Why don't we open it up?
We don't have time.
We don't have time? Okay, fine. You want me to ask the question? Okay. I'm going to ask you a tough one, though.
Ask me the creative.
Okay, fine.
A wedding, or when I was doing the million things a shul rabbi does, right? Or every Shabbos morning, every daily minyan. Those things are so important. They keep the world going, but they keep the world going like it's always been going. When you do something creative, you feel for a moment that maybe that wheel is going to stop a little bit, and maybe there's a possibility that it can now, things can go in a different direction. And we always, the Jewish people always, need that, and the world needs that.
Amazing. Can I just say one small
Sure.
thing? Because we mentioned creativity. There are all these stories about Rav Kook and creativity. There's also stories about Rav Shagar and creativity. So I just wanted to say one story about each, just very shortly. There's a story about Shai Gnon, the famous writer who came to, one time he came to Rav Kook, and Rav Kook said, "Why haven't you shown me any of your books? I want to read your books. Everyone talks about your books." So Shai Gnon says, "Are you sure you want to read them? I don't think the content you would like necessarily. If anybody's read Shai Gnon's books, they're not all PG rated." So Rav Kook says, "I want to read them, bring them." So I don't know exactly how long after, but he brings all his books. He brings a huge amount anyway, and drops them off at Rav Kook's house, and then Rav Kook goes through them, and the next time Shai Gnon comes over, he's waiting patiently. What does Rav Kook think of all of his, creativity? And Rav Kook says, there's this halakha that if you have a pot of meat and like 1/60th of non-kosher meat drops in, it's still kosher. So too with your creativity. Even if there's a small part that I don't agree with, it's so incredible. So that's just a great example of his embracing of creativity, even when he's being honest that there is something clearly he disagrees with, but creativity for Rav Kook is itself its own value. Just one small story about Rav Shagar. So he had this newspaper in his religious Zionist yeshiva. I can't remember the name of it. That his students would write poems, and then Rav Shagar would write commentaries on his students' poems. And they're actually in his books. Some of Rav Shagar's students wrote a poem, and we actually have his commentaries and how he explained them, and really phenomenal. So one time they had a reading night about all the poems, and so his students got up to read, and one of the students who ended up becoming quite a famous poet in Israel, he didn't read his poem. Rav Shagar didn't talk about the student's poem, and he went up to the student later on, and he said, "I apologize for not bringing up your poem. I didn't feel like I could do justice to it. It was such a good poem." So both of them had this incredible respect towards their students, not just intellectually, but creatively. Okay, fine. With that, I want to introduce Professor Yehudah Mirsky of Brandeis University. Professor Mirsky is one of the leading experts on the thought of Rav Kook. His intellectual biography on Rav Kook, A Mystic in a Time of Revolution, won a National Jewish Book Award. And the Hebrew version of the book recently came out here in Israel. Just this year, he also published a thorough analysis of Rav Kook's early thought, titled Towards the Mystical Experience of Modernity. Rabbi Truba shared with me that one of the things that draws him to Professor Mirsky is that he understands ideas were not meant to be locked up in a university library, but they only really gain their meaning out in the world. And that is where we have to try to understand them.
Great. So thank you so much. Thank you to everyone, to Yedidya, Kvod Achsanya, and thank you so much for this evening. What can I say? Rabbi Truboff, my admiration for you has only grown and deepened over the years. There aren't many people who live their ideas like you do. And every exchange we have in person or in email, and how can I, there's no hakol emet, and it doesn't come often enough in this world. Thank you. This book, it's a wonderful, wonderful book. Also, it's beautifully written. It's lucid. It has a range of registers, at times descriptive, at times analytic, at times very passionate. And what one of the things that strikes me about this volume and especially in not unrelated to some aspects of Inyana Dioma, is that it's a profoundly dialogical book. There's multiple dialogues going on here in this book. First of, just at the matter of style, there's Rabbi Truo's dialogue with the reader. This reader, sure, being educated, but never talked at, certainly never talked down to, and as an authorial voice, Rabbi Truo creates a space where the reader can think. And this book is obviously a dialogue between, him, Rabbi Truboff, and Rav Kook and Rav Shagar, and between the two of them. And also, one of the things that's really interesting about the book is that it's a dialogue between religious Zionism and American-style modern Orthodoxy, of a sort that rarely happens from people who truly understand both sides. I don't want to take up a whole lot of your time, though I will just say sort of I'll be coming back to dialogue at the end as well. And also I don't want to take up the time because I can't acknowledge the presence of a massive scholar like Professor Tamar Ross, whose works I was reading literally today again. So I just, katonti to be talking about these things with you sitting. I did one element that speaks to me out of this book that I think is extremely pertinent for the present moment is the theological critique of ideology. The theological critique of ideology. Ideology is the idea that I have a political idea, and with my political idea in hand, I know how the world works, and I know how the world is supposed to work. I know how other people are supposed to fit in this world, and I know what I'm supposed to do. And ideology comes in that sort of marvelous self-absorbed certainty, comes in multiple forms. Read any sociology written in the post-war years, and religion is obviously on its way out. I mean, it's just, it's a function, it's like modernization theory 101, that, religion is going to vanish. And of course, no absence of ideologies here in the present, and of course ideologies that are based on theologies, the translation of religious ideas into concrete political programs and all-encompassing political programs. Now, in the case of Rav Kook, it's complicated, because in some respects he invites this. Right? The Rambam in his theological writings isn't commenting echad al echad on the social and political movements of his time. Rav Kook is. Not because the Rambam wasn't involved in the political events or social life of his time, but it's theologically not consequential to him. And for Rav Kook it is. And at the same time, there's a deep sense in which Rav Kook, to my mind, isn't really about politics and doesn't really work as a political thinker. He doesn't have a theory of government. He doesn't have it is possible, I think Rav Yoel Ben-Nun in his book HaMakor HaKaful does take out of Rav Kook the most coherent sort of political program you can get, but it's still rather vague in many ways. And certainly this notion of politics as the, how could I put this? Politics as the enshrinement of things never getting worked out to the end. To be perfectly honest, I've long thought that a great, one of the things I appreciate, obviously in Rav Kook, but also in Rav Shagar, is also Rav Shagar's willingness to learn from and be challenged by the Haredi world. I've always thought it's sort of a pity that the Haredi world's critique of Zionism has focused so much on, they're all Mechalei Shabbos and eating treif and stuff, when it's like that this is that this could be a form of Avodah Zarah is a much more powerful critique, and only a few Haredi thinkers like Isaac Ward really raised it. Now, elements of this are perhaps emerged. There are a couple of passages here in the book that I just wanted to highlight. So Rabbi Truvah quotes the very celebrated passage from Rav Kook, which Rav Amital used to quote a great deal about, right, how it is forbidden, on page 88, it is forbidden for fear of heaven to push away one's natural morality, right? Asur yirat shamayim shetitzak musar TV. And so on the one hand, there's this affirmation of like a basic sense of right and wrong, of moral instincts, of moral sensibilities. It's the first Jewish thinker to think that way. But what's interesting is it's also a theological affirmation, because it's part of believing in God, and believing in God's goodness is that God created a good world and created good human beings. It's sort of the fundamental substrate on which all religion and theology rises. Has to be this divine goodness. If it subverts itself, then it's working at cross purposes with itself. And at the same time, Rav Kook is also talking about the behavior of Pashut Yidden. And people who behave well. People who are menschlich in their daily lives. And that's no small thing. And sometimes that seems to be also like one of the most profound answers to large ideologies. Albert Camus was famously asked, right, how come he wasn't sufficiently supportive of ideals of revolutionary liberation? And he said, well, today in Algiers, bombs are going off on train stations. In Algeria, my mother might be on one of those. So does your idea of revolutionary transformation entail blowing up my mother? And Rabbi Truvah puts it really beautifully. Piety must never make one deaf to the cries of those who are suffering, regardless of whether one agrees with them or not. Sort of fundamental moral sense is a fundamental awareness and receptivity to human suffering. I always imagine, for what it's worth, I always imagine if I get to Elam Emes, and Be'er Shalom asks me, how come you were cruel to so-and-so on such a day? And if I say to him, "V'chashavti Rav Kook amar sheze b'seder gamur," I imagine her Be'er Shalom tell me, "I'll be very team Rav Kook, I need to be Rav Kook, I need to go, Nachru Sababa." Otcham Yishoel. Because today we are interpreters of Rav Kook. Ein ma lasot, he died in 1935. How we interpret texts, certainly how we interpret the text that we take as representing an authoritative voice of a Torah figure, is itself taking on a moral responsibility. And Rav Shagar, I have to say, as I was reading this book, thinking Rabbi Amital, it's known, had some principled criticisms of Rav Shagar as far as educational philosophy and so on. And yet I remember when Rav Shagar was in his final illness, and there was an erev of study, an evening of study in Lizkuto, where it was refuah. Rav Amital spoke, and one of the things he said was, he said to Rav Shagar, I am in Shmato shel Rabbi Meir. Right? Because as I'll say, Rabbi Meir, the pasuk says that God made Kotnot Or, right? That God made Adam and Eve garments of skin, of leather, and in Torah shel Rabbi Meir it said Kotnot Or with an olive. And I'll say, Rav Shagar, he saw or with an olive where I saw or with an ayin. All this postmodern stuff. And somehow he saw in it a great revelation. And I was thinking of that as I was reading this book, and it also it made me think once again that postmodernism that in some respects, I don't think, I don't know if in the universities, they'd be teaching, Rav Shagar, but he seems to get to the heart of it because he understands the ways in which if it's not that the insights of postmodernism, if they're not fundamentally theological, then they become truly destructive. Right? The sense that there's a great infinite, that we can never grasp the entire truth, that our large programs never really work, the truth is always receding before us without our being told that is a deep moral truth of the universe, it leads to disaster. And that's what he understands, and what's also, frankly, what's so powerful with one of the things so powerful with the Rav Shagar is his willingness to put trauma front and center, including his understanding of Israeli experience. Coming out of the Yom Kippur War, of course, but not only. And I think that this, and he does so by this wonderful use, which Rabbi Truboff illuminates of the term of the brid, because the honest truth is covenantal theology is something I've always had certain trouble understanding, and it's illuminated so beautifully in this book as like a commitment to engage and be in dialogue and build a life together with someone day in, day out in this constant process of negotiation and renegotiation and thought. And at the same time, where this element of the sort of the ultimate unknowability of things is also true in a relationship. When I teach, I tell students, okay, think about someone you really, really know, your parent, your sibling, your roommate. Think about them all the way up and all the way down, and then ask them, do you really, 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 really know them all the way down? I think about a concept like justice or truth or mercy. All the way up and all the way down, but you really have them in the palm of your hand. And there's something that mystery and unknowability can have a saving grace if it leads us to a kind of epistemological humility. Now, it's in there in Rav Kook, too. Sort of at the far end of things. So in the middle, there's just the drama, and there's the passion, and there's the affirming this and affirming that. And Rav Shagar foregrounds it. And in part foregrounds it because of the trauma. Also because of the Shoah, because of the traumas. Now, this also leads to a different understanding of halakha as grounding a kind of, or structuring an ongoing dialogue, right? Actually, that works with the authority structures of halakha. We could talk about another time, but to me that was part of what was so, I think the books in which Rabbi Truboff talks about his own and Jen's experiences are so powerful and so illuminating because of the way they illustrate brit and dialogue and people doing their best to figure out their lives together, sometimes in the face of very challenging circumstances. And the rabbi / halachist is there as a person engaged in dialogue. Which means also you may have stumbled across finally the halachic answer to Martin Buber. But I think this theological critique, and so what I would just end with, this theological critique of ideology, that these grand, all-encompassing truths that we can easily translate into one political program or another, be it left or right, in fairness, are profoundly flawed. The alternative to them isn't nihilism, it's perhaps, again, this work of grit and dialogue and working together under the aegis of eternal truths whose ultimate seed we will never grasp, right? The Navi says, V'yigal kamay mishpat, there's no single piece of legislation that we can point to and say, okay, now, justice is now officially rolling forth like a mighty stream, right? and also the grounding of this in the facts of everyday life and the simple morality that people show one another and the effects of one combat veteran trying to make sense of what he had experienced in a war, that gives this the great humanity, and the kind of humanity that can be transcendent and hopefully give us strength. So thank you so much. Thank you.
Our next speaker, thank you very much. Our next speaker is Rabbi Dr. Eitan Abromovitch, a teacher at Yeshivat Siach Yitzchak, the yeshiva founded by Rav Shagar, and he's also one of the lead editors of Rav Shagar's writings. Rabbi Trubov got to know Rabbi Eitan by participating in a special program at Yeshivat Siach that brought together a small group of rabbis to think about critical issues and questions. Rabbi Eitan is not only an expert in the thought of Rav Shagar, but he's also a thoughtful rabbi and thinker in his own right. And in this sense, you really typify many of Rav Shagar's students who are just such profound thinkers in their own way. And it would be enough just to hear you speak about your own ideas and insights, but we'd love you to come up and talk about Rav Shagar and the book a little bit, please.
Thank you, Rabbi. First of all, I think my main role here is to speak bad English with an Hebrew accent, and I also allow myself to rely on my page. And secondly, to try to represent Rav Shagar's students. I think there's a connection between these two things, between feeling embarrassed and out of context, comparing to the other fluent speakers we heard here. I think it's something that relates to Rav Shagar Torah and what we can take from Rabbi Trubov's book in the context we are talking about, the crisis that was in the headline of this part of the evening, but we'll get to that. First of all, I'd like to thank Rabbi Trubov for inviting me to speak here, and also for our ongoing discussions, many hours of dialogue about Rav Shagar's Torah during the years. It started, like he said, exactly 5 years ago, when I was together with Rabbi Ari working in Cleveland, Rav Trubov's Kehillat in Cleveland, and when Rav Trubov and his family made Aliyah and came here, I also had the privilege of leading the Tzorufim program in Yeshivat Siach Yitzchak with him. So we had an opportunity for many hours of conversations about Rav Shagar Torah, in which I felt that my role, or I was supposed to be the one who knows, the one who met Rav Shagar in his life, the one who knows him from the inside, when in fact the question that Rabbi Trubov asked me always gave me a new point of view on the subject we discussed. And I found that the fact that Rabbi Trubov, in a sense, comes from the outside to these ideas, to this Torah, he comes from different backgrounds, and he didn't know Rav Shagar in his lifetime, and didn't met him personally. It gave a different tone and different color to the idea that I was familiar with. And approaching Rav Shagar Torah from the outside, I think it stresses one specific aspect of his Torah that I believe is connected to what we're talking about here, the situation that is in the background of these discussions, some of we heard in this evening. What I mean to say is, as we heard, Rav Shagar was deeply rooted in his religious Zionist background, and he felt at home in the state of Israel, which he almost never left. And also he had a Haredic-like, undisputed connection to Torah and Halacha. And he also spoke, as we heard, he also taught that feeling at home by Tiyut is something that is an important spiritual goal. Rabbi Trubov described it beautifully in this book. At the same time, he was also an outsider, maybe even a foreigner regarding his community, the religious Zionist world, regarding the Torah world, and other rabbis of his generation. It was always interesting to compare Rav Shagar's writing to other people who were together with him, who gone through the same path. I edited once an article about an essay by Rav Shagar for a book Sefer Zikaron for one of the friends who died in the tank when he was in Yom Kippur. So there was a book about several rabbis from this generation, from Keren Beyavne, wrote articles, and Rav Shagar's article and also Rav Dreyfus was so different from everything else that was in this book. It was amazing to think that they grew together. And in a way, I felt that Rav Shagar is more connected to my generation than to the generation of Hebrew rabbin. So there was a part of it, I think, you can see it in idea that he's an outsider. He is looking at things from the outside. And Rabbi Kook showed this in his book in several specific contexts, how Rav Shagar's ideas refuses to align itself with standard religious Zionist ideas. For example, he is not identifying with the left or with the right. He's talking about something different. He's looking for different syntheses. He's talking about a synthesis between Zionism and exile. So there's something about it that he's always uncomfortable with the place he is. And I think this duality of being deeply inside and at the same time looking from the outside, it's one of the driving forces of Rav Shagar's Torah. It's one of the sources of his creativity and diversity that is so unique to him. And this constant discomfort is what pushes him forward. So, when I was speaking with Rabbi Dr. about Rav Shagar, I was facing the embodiment of some of the metaphors that Rav Shagar used to describe this duality that I'm talking about. For example, I speak about two terms. Rav Shagar is writing a lot about Targum, translations, and about Galut, about living in exile. But for him, these were metaphors for some existential state of translating the Torah into secular language, other languages, to look at it from the outside, and also talking about living in exile as some kind of existential situation where you're not specifically at home in any place. But speaking with Rabbi Dr, I felt that he's taking these ideas and he's turning them to something. It's like testing them, how they're working in the literal sense. What happens? I felt also when I got to teach Rav Shagar's ideas to American Jews in America or something here, or doing always very interesting to me, very exciting to see how these ideas, what happens to them when you're talking to them, even specifically when you're talking to them, when you're teaching them in English, when you're talking with people who come from very different backgrounds. And sometimes, for example, when Rav Shagar is talking about living in multiple worlds, I used to think about from the context that maybe Rav Shagar and I are close to, you're living a religious Zionist world here, and you have secular neighbors and you have Haredi neighbors, but when you're talking about living in multiple worlds, two people who live in Manhattan, it's totally different. You feel that this is the real thing. You're not living in multiple worlds. You don't know anyone who is not Jewish personally. You never walk to the street feeling that people are totally living totally different life next to you. So part of my encounter with Rabbi Dr is, I think, part of what I think his book is doing, I think maybe the first contribution that it has to the small but expanding shelf of books about Rav Shagar is that it puts these ideas into test in the real reality, taking the metaphors and realizing them, if that's the right term, and mamesh את המטאפורות האלה, to test them in reality and to see how it works. I think it's not a coincidence that maybe it's the first or maybe the second book you mentioned books about Rav Shagar. I don't know if there are any books, maybe one or two, and I think the one that I can remember now is also in English.
Yes.
So it's very interesting. Also, last week somebody told me maybe there's a book of stories about Rav Shagar. I told him, yes, there's one, but it's in English. It's very interesting. Not just, I think, the need to introduce Rav Shagar to people who can't read him in Hebrew. It's also, I think, that's maybe the second contribution that I think that this book has, looking at Rav Shagar Torah from the outside. And it's something that Torah specifically needs, and it stresses this aspect of Rav Shagar. What was unique for him was the feeling that he's not exactly the Toch Beit Yud, as he called this tension that he was speaking about and embodying in his writing as a source of creativity and openness. It reminded me of things that Rav Shagar wrote after the Itnatkut, the disengagement. Maybe an opposite situation in a way for what we're here, because Rav Shagar thought that this situation, which was a defeat for religious Zionism, will be something that could take us for, called it, לצאת לגלות, in Sefer HaKinot B'Yadin. I think he quoted it to somebody else, and he said, okay, this is an opportunity to create a community which is taking a step backward, taking a little distance from the Israeli society. We think about how we want to see ourselves anew. And I think it did happen. Many things that Rav Shagar thought that will happen, I think, politically, maybe even turn the other way. And maybe that's the situation that we are now, which is, in a way, for some of us, maybe a religious Zionist victory. It's also a situation that puts some of us outside and puts us as outsiders in our community. Maybe this time this will be a situation that will turn Rav Shagar's ideas to something that we can benefit from. Thank you very much. Good evening.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Eitan. Okay, to close our evening, I want to invite up the author himself, Rabbi Dr, to do some closing words.
So there are many reasons that make this this night special, and it's just a great honor to have so many of the speakers here tonight who were so instrumental in my own intellectual, spiritual journey, without which the book wouldn't at all be possible. And to have you not just have been at different points in my journey, but now all here together is just profoundly meaningful to me. The book's titled "Torah Goes Forth from Zion." Though the book did not begin in Zion, and a large part of the book was not written here in the land of Israel. The book really began in Cleveland, Ohio, which, depending on how you look at it, is either really, really close to Israel, because it's a profoundly Zionist place, and it often feels, if you've ever been in Cleveland at Mizrahi on Yom HaAtzmaut, that you're just a hop, skip, and a jump away from the land of Israel. On the other hand, as somebody who didn't grow up in the Midwest, I grew up on the East Coast, there were times where Cleveland felt, as Rabbi Nachman calls it, galut shebegalut, right? Like you are as far away from anything that you think you know as could be. But the book really began, in a certain sense, through the work I was doing in Cleveland while I was a shul rabbi in a program that Sarah Hurand and I founded together called the Cleveland Jewish Arts and Culture Lab, which I mentioned before. And what was so profound about that program, first off, it's the only educational program I've ever done that had like 100% success rate. Every artist who went through it just thought it was the most amazing thing ever. That never happened before, it will never happen again, anything I ever do. But what was profound was the work, the dialogical work, as you know, beautifully, that I did with Sarah and that we did with our artists, and just the impact that it had on me. My parents will tell you, I did not necessarily see myself as a deeply creative person when I was growing up. I had a degree in engineering, I worked as an engineer, and that program was the opportunity for me to find my creativity, in a certain sense to find my neshama, and in an even deeper sense to connect to Torah like I never had before. Most of the artists in the group were visual artists. I'm never going to be a visual artist. I'm a rabbi. My medium is always going to be words. And it was through that program I really connected to poetry. And one thing that always drew me into it was the very basic fact that in Hebrew, or I should say the Torah itself, describes itself as a shirah, as a song. And in Hebrew there's no distinction between the words song and poetry. There's only one word for both. It's shirah, right? So Torah is always both song and poetry, because anybody who's been on to shul on Shabbat morning knows, right? Torah is a poem that we just can't help but sing, right? That's the way it means to read, to engage the Torah. Sarah and I, and our families, one of the more amazing things was that we somehow managed to make our ways to Israel right around the same time as each other, which to this day feels like it's Mina Shemayim. Again, you never know what is in front of you, but if you're open to the possibility that something new can emerge, usually that's going to mean good things, even if it also means very difficult things along the way as well. After we arrived here, already I guess a year and a half ago, Sarah reached out to me about her brother Josh, Josh Hurand, to whom the book is dedicated in memory of. I didn't know Josh very well. I'd met him once or twice before, very briefly. I knew that he had received a cancer diagnosis, a very serious cancer diagnosis the year before, and it was not in a particularly great situation. He had young children, had been married for a few years, and Sarah reached out to connect us because she felt correctly, as Sarah often does and knows, that something truly beneficial for Josh and also for me could come out of that relationship. And it began by us studying Torah together, because that's what a rabbi is going to do. And probably even more importantly than studying Torah, it also was about studying poetry together. Josh was a poet, and Josh and I came from very, very different worlds, but what immediately enabled us to bond with each other was our mutual love of poetry, which directly extended into a mutual love of Torah, which also fed our love of the Jewish people and our love for the land of Israel. I think our learning provided Josh with support that he needed, an opportunity to reflect, to find comfort, but it also gave me something critical as well, because our learning took place right at the time I was trying to finish the book. And when you're in a book project, if anybody who's ever written a book knows, right, the last 20% of it is always the hardest part, right? It's the part that seems like it's going to go on forever. And learning with Josh was the experience I needed, the inspiration I needed to finish the book, and it was one that really touched my very soul, just as Sarah and my experience together doing the Arts and Culture Lab did the same. Josh was an accomplished poet, and he used poetry in a very, very interesting way. There are many kinds of poets out there, just as there are many kinds of rabbis. Josh was not the kind of poet who was infatuated with words, always trying to string them together in more and more creative ways. Josh was the kind of poet who wanted to connect words to life. And what he wrote are what he called moment poems. Poems intended to capture something unique about a moment that he had experienced. It was always a challenge for him. There was always like an avoda, a real work that went into one of these poems, because if you're trying to squeeze out the meaning of life into words, we all know how difficult that is. But he was committed to this, that we could put into words something of the inexpressible, something of what we had experienced, something of the infinite. If life can be reduced to words, of course, right, there'd be no reason to ever leave our homes or do anything. Right? So Josh's poems, of course, were always an attempt to put into words that by which its very nature exceeds the meaning that words can ever fully convey. In our time together, we studied many of the texts and ideas that appeared in the book. And I think the reason Josh was drawn to the teachings of Rav Kook and Rav Shagar is because of something anyone who reads their writings inevitably encounters. Both Rav Kook and Rav Shagar share an awareness that the Torah is a form of poetry. And to teach Torah or to write Torah is to offer a poem to the world. Both Rav Kook and Rav Shagar wrote poetry. They wrote their own poems. Some of them we have, some of it we'll never see. But it's so important to me that they did that. And I think it was to Josh as well. Josh wrote moment poems. Rav Kook and Rav Shagar wrote poems of a slightly different kind. It was poems of Torah that was meant to speak directly to the moments in which they found themselves. And while this may not sound like such a chiddush, right, that's what every rabbi is supposed to do, make Torah relevant, in orthodoxy, such an inclination is not always considered so desirable. Because if the Torah is meant to be eternal, how can it possibly be reduced to a single moment? The present, which is of course ephemeral. Right? There's a famous rabbinic aphorism that's attributed to the Shla Kadosh. Right? Ha'avar ayin va'atid adayin v'hahoveh keheref ayin. The past is gone, the future has not yet occurred, and the present disappears in the blink of an eye. How can the Torah speak to the present if the present is gone before we ever know it? For many rabbis, the idea that Torah must speak to the here and now and all of its messiness is a heretical idea. Right? Even in the worlds of poetry, right? It's considered somewhat crude to write as Josh did, right? Like we're going to just take a moment and turn it into into poem, right? The great poets must write with an eye towards posterity, right? They're not just writing for the here and now. They're writing to make something eternal, which is what the great rabbis, for the most part, think that they are doing as well, right? They must write their words with the aim that those words will be around forever. But of course, as God makes clear, the Torah is not rooted just in the past, thousands of years ago in the darkest or distant reaches of history. Rather, kol yom vayom yotze bat kol me har chorev. Every day a heavenly voice goes out from har chorev, from Sinai, or as God says in Devarim, vayam shemo tishmu mitzvotai asher anochi mitzaveh etchem hayom. We must listen to God not in the past, but today, in the here and now. The Torah may be eternal, but if it does not speak to the moment we find ourselves in, if it does not seek to make contact with reality, if Shemaim and Aretz, heaven and earth, cannot come together just to kiss for one moment, of what worth can the Torah truly be for us? For if it doesn't speak to the moment, how can we ever claim that the Torah speaks to us at all? Human beings aren't eternal. Right? Each one of us has a finite time upon this earth, and when we die, life will go on without us, whether we like it or not. What Josh understood, what Rav Kook and Rav Shagar understood, is that when we bring together that which is eternal with that which is not, even if it is just for a moment, what is created is something that endures, something that remains, something that we call Torah. In writing a book about figures from the past, at some point you come to realize that no matter how much you may want it to be otherwise, the only way you can ever really encounter them is through words. Right? Their words are the words of others about them. One might think this is limiting, and in a sense it is. As I said, words can never grasp the totality of the world around us and our experiences within it. To encounter another person only through words, no matter how great they may have been, is to know that something is still missing. But at the same time, words endure. Words remain. Words continue on even when the one who has spoke them or wrote them can no longer be found. And if those words merit to capture something of the eternal and the transient, then we have no choice but to recognize them for what they are, and to recognize that they are Torah. What I want to do is I want to share a piece of Josh's Torah with you today. And again, the reason I see this as Josh's Torah, as real Torah, is the same reason I see Rav Shagar and Rav Kook's writings as Torah, because they do this as well. They give you that moment of that possibility where Shemayim v'Aretz kiss, even if it's just for an instant. What I want to share with you is a poem that Josh wrote. He sent it to me not long after we started learning together. And when writing a poem, Josh would often note the time and the place from which it emerged. This poem was written when Josh had come to Israel in order to receive an experimental treatment for his cancer. And he notes it was composed in Eli and Sarah's dining room in Tel Aviv on February 14th, 2021. That's not a day that holds any great significance for me, and probably not for any of us here as well, but it did for Josh. And the poem is a reaction to the cancer treatment Josh had just received and a reflection on what was still yet to come. And it's titled The First Blast and What Remains. The first dose poked a nest of hibernating hornets. Hornets held tightly around larvae, compounding in nests throughout the bones. That first dose, synthetic isotope, a concentrated fire hose blasting radiation to every worker, every queen, dispersing them into a phosphoric frenzy. The sneak attack is no nuclear holocaust, not yet anyway. These singed cells are swinging, are stinging. How many survive the blast? When the pain subsides, life opens like a sunrise. The future manifests as a sweet fruit, ripening on a tree out of reach but in sight. I imagine the nectar of a miracle dripping down my chin. I have to believe that Rav Kook and Rav Shagar would have appreciated Josh's poem for a few reasons. It was written during Josh's time in Israel, and in that way, it serves as his own contribution to Torah Eretz Yisrael that Rav Kook and Rav Shagar strive so hard to bring into being. However, there's something much deeper they would have identified in it as well. Like Josh, Rav Kook and Rav Shagar each suffered from and eventually died from cancer. And for both of them, too soon. For Rav Shagar, certainly, but for Rav Kook as well. With both of them, there was a sense that they still had so much more to give, so much more to teach us. They experience cancer's brutality, the way that it destroys the body piece by piece by piece. But like Josh, they refuse to let their pain and suffering define them, even as it unfairly took so much away. But ultimately, it's the last part of the poem that would have mattered the most to them, where Josh says, when the pain subsides, life opens like a sunrise. The future manifests as a sweet fruit ripening on a tree out of reach, but in sight, I imagine the nectar of a miracle dripping down my chin. To be a religious Zionist, to be a Jew, means learning how to live with pain. But it also means believing in miracles. For if Torah, a poem that combines the eternal and the moment, is to be understood as anything, it can only be understood as a miracle. And because it's a miracle, even when everything else has been taken away, the Torah endures. The Torah remains. About those who are no longer in the world, we say Yehei Zichram Baruch, that their memories should be for a blessing. And in truth, that's the best that most of us can hope for. That when we are no longer here, those who knew us will remember us, and their memories of us will inspire them and give them comfort. However, there are certain individuals who merit a little more than that. They merit not only that their memories should be for a blessing, but that their words should be for a blessing as well. That people will read them and discover something not just about the one who wrote them, but also about the one who uttered the very first words of creation, Vayihi Or, and brought light to the darkness, thereby making life and all of its impossible messiness possible, and more importantly, worth living. If there is a Torah that goes forth from Zion, it is a Torah made up of these words. And I'm profoundly grateful to Josh, to Rav Kook, and to Rav Shagar for bequeathing them to us. I am grateful because I know that Am Yisrael still has so much more to learn from them, and I'm grateful because I know that I still have so much more to learn from them. And I only hope that my book can be a contribution as well. I'll say Yehei Kitvam Baruch. May their writings, the writings of Josh and Rav Kook and Rav Shagar, forever be a blessing. I want to thank you all for coming tonight. I know I went a little bit over here, but I appreciate your patience. If anyone wants to buy a copy, they're for sale in the back. And I think we're going to try to daven Marv upstairs in just a few minutes. And again, thank you to all the speakers. Thank you all for coming.